We could think about housing in such a different way if we start thinking about more communal forms of living, access to childcare near our homes, communal cooking facilities. Having that as a horizon, for me, that's such a more interesting version of thinking about housing than just being like, oh, we want to return to like mid-20th century forms of housing, because that's just like, it's a bit boring.
Hi, I am Helen Hester and I'm here today with Alva Gotby. Hi Alva, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good, thanks.
It's so nice to see you. Obviously, we've worked together in many capacities in the past, but we are here today to kind of talk about where your work and my work intersects in a way, because I feel like you've written a book about housing that necessarily talks a lot about work, and I've written a book about work that necessarily talks a lot about housing. So we're kind of engaged in kind of complementary endeavours, I think, to some extent. So I was thinking about this before we kind of got together, and I have a couple of questions or points or sort of things for discussion about the book. And the first thing I wanted to dive in with was this idea of crisis. So for me, I feel like this book is really a response to its time, and it's also a response to the issues that you as an organiser encounter as part of your working life. And the blurb kind of on your little your dust jacket here says that Alva Gotby makes clear that solving the housing crisis is about much more than housing stock. It is about revolutionising our everyday lives and labours. So I wanted to talk a bit about this framing of crisis, because this is one that people are now fairly familiar with, not least through the way that something like the care crisis is discussed. But this is a framing that you sort of question to some extent in the book. So you suggest that the term crisis risks suggesting something exceptional, right? So it suggests a situation that's coming to a head, or a situation that's reaching a turning point, after which things will either like finally recover or they will somehow definitively collapse. And as I was reading your comments on that, I was thinking about Nancy Fraser's essay, Contradictions of Capital and Care, in which she argues that the present strains on care have, and this is a quote, deep systemic roots in the structure of our social order. Her argument is that the present crisis of social reproduction indicates something rotten not only in capitalism's current financialised form, but in capitalist society per se. So the situation we find ourselves in is simply sort of the current distinctive expression of a tendency that is in fact inherent to capitalism itself. So I just wondered what your thoughts might be on this idea of crisis as a framing. So what does it enable us to do? What are its limits in terms of thinking about housing in particular today?
Yeah, I mean, I think this project sort of comes from wanting to think a bit more about like a housing crisis for whom, in a way. And the first chapter, which I started writing, I wrote a first draft of that in 2020 when I was quite new to doing housing organising. And obviously that was a moment where a lot of people were using the term crisis in all sorts of ways for very understandable reasons. And there was this idea that there was a sort of crisis unfolding, but sort of after the pandemic or after the housing crisis had sort of been resolved, we would be able to return to something that was like a normal state of things. And I exactly wanted to make that argument as quite similar to Fraser's argument in a way that so many of these things that we think of as sort of crisis symptoms are actually the sort of normal reality for a lot of people. And for many people sort of in the working class, going back to a sort of pre-crisis normal, that's not really sort of something that they have ever known in a way. So it was trying to make that argument, and the book as a whole kind of comes from that, thinking about this idea of a housing crisis, but thinking about how the sort of impact on different groups has been like really, it's very unevenly distributed in a way. And for some people it's been the crisis sort of been the normal state for many decades, or forever in a way, because it's sort of part of capitalism. And I think the term crisis is obviously doing some political work, and that's, the housing movement has mobilized this term of a crisis in order to make change, and that is obviously very important. It has an important political function in that way, and exactly to sort of denormalize the present moment. But for some people, the housing system as we know it is working very well, and they have an interest in preserving how it's working today. So for them, sort of, it's not really a crisis. This is like good. And for other people, again, people who have sort of been excluded from this idea of like the normal state of housing, who've never had access to that stability, that the like good normal housing system that we think of. For them, this is maybe not so much of a crisis, but more of a continuation of how they've sort of always experienced their housing.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a time to jump into organising, like 2020. And because I obviously things were changing quite a lot at that time as well. And I think I've mentioned to you before that I, in very many ways, see this book as kind of like a transition. Well, maybe not a transition, but as like the joining point between what you were doing with your PhD and with your first book, They Call It Love, which was about the emotional politics of late capitalism, and your organising work. So, was it sort of like your existing body of knowledge just being applied to that sort of new context of your sort of working life as an organiser? Was that sort of how this emerged to some extent? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was very shortly after I finished my PhD thesis that then became They Call It Love. For me, when I first got involved in the housing movement, it was obvious that this was like a question of reproduction, and social reproduction was like so core in everything that we were doing, but it often wasn't articulated in that way. I think housing politics has tended to be framed in terms of like ownership or like the legal structure of the housing system. So I guess what I wanted to do with this book project was also to add a bit of that framework of like drawing on a Marxist feminist tradition, thinking about social reproduction as like, really core to how the capitalist economy is functioning. Just like making sure that perspective is also included when we think about housing politics, because that is sort of the reason why housing is so important to so many people, is that, it's so essential for like maintaining a decent quality of life. Yeah, this really gets to my next question, actually, because this idea of the housing crisis isn't the only kind of seemingly uncontroversial topic or idea that you kind of gently nudge against or prompt your reader to question to some extent. There are two key tenets of contemporary housing activism that you urge the reader to reconsider, I think. And the first, and it relates to what you were just saying, and from my point of view, I think it's really the clarion call of the book. It's one of its standout achievements for me, is that you question this idea that building public housing is the answer to our problems. So that, okay, it's pretty widely accepted, I think, as a solution to our current circumstances, to our issues with shelter. And it's a way of dealing with the fact that decent housing is chronically inaccessible for so many people today. So, what's the answer? Well, we massively expand the stock of council-owned properties. But from your point of view, this just isn't an adequate option for the housing movement. It's not an adequate response. So I think that will feel quite counterintuitive to some people. So I wondered if it might be a good idea to take a moment to explain why that's the case. Yeah, I mean, I think the way that many people sort of articulate a solution to the housing crisis, as you said, is this idea that we can kind of do the same thing that worked in the sort of mid-20th century, which was a mass council housing building program that was replacing a lot of this sort of the slum housing that had existed, and also replaced a lot of the bomb damage housing that sort of was. Cities like London was just like full of housing that's been damaged by the war. And then, there was a desperate shortage of housing, and
because of that war damage and because of the slums starting to be sort of demolished or cleared. And the response was the state sort of taking the responsibility to build lots of housing. And in some ways that was, a very successful program. It's managed to like massively expand the housing stock. It managed to build some of it was, high quality housing, and it was people, working class people had access to better quality housing than they had previously. But I think this idea that we could just do that again, it's, we need to think quite carefully about that. And one part of that, which I don't think we talk about enough, is the sort of the climate impact of a mass building program. The sort of materials that we now take for granted as like what we use to build high quality housing is like concrete, steel, brick, glass. All of them very sort of take up a lot of energy. Concrete especially is very bad for the climate. And in that, from that perspective, it doesn't matter if the properties that are built are sort of, luxury flats or if it's council housing. The climate impact is the same. So for that reason, I'm quite critical of any ideas of just like trying to build ourselves out of this housing crisis. I don't think people who in mainstream housing discourse have really reckoned with the fact that that's just not going to be sustainable. But even for the people who are like, even for people who have a slightly different version of this argument, and maybe saying more that we can sort of reclaim housing, currently existing housing, as council housing, I think there are some limitations to that argument. And obviously, I mean, just to use a personal example, I live in a former council house on a council estate that was sold through Right to Buy and then ended up in the hands of a private landlord. And now, I pay way more rent than my neighbours, and actually my landlord is now threatening to evict me just because he doesn't like me, basically.
He's read the book.
I don't think he's read the book, but, he's decided that I'm, no longer able to live there.
I'm sorry, that's awful.
Yeah. But so if someone knocked on my door tomorrow and said, "Oh, the council has bought this property back and now your rent has been halved and you can stay here forever," obviously I would be like, "That's great."
Yeah.
But I think the way that this is articulated as sort of just like the solution to the sort of housing system that we're in today, it sort of needs to be nuanced a little bit. Many people they already have the council as their landlord and they're not very happy with that. Councils are often quite bad landlords and that's partly because of underfunding and governments, both Labour and Tory, have sort of prevented councils from properly looking after their properties. But even when you look at texts from sort of 60s and 70s, what many people consider the sort of golden age of the UK housing system, people who were council tenants at that time weren't always happy with that system. And people who weren't council tenants at that time were not happy with the fact that they couldn't access council housing, often because of various sort of discriminatory grounds. Councils had ideas of who would make their ideal tenants and so on. So there were various limitations to that project. Sort of even in the best version of it. And often, those homes were sort of built on an idea of a nuclear family, a sort of white upper working class or middle class nuclear family as the sort of ideal occupants of those homes, and had this idea of respectability. Only a certain type of tenants were good enough to like access that higher quality housing, and everyone else should sort of sort themselves out through the private sector, even if that was like quite small at the time.
Yeah, I feel like with that sort of nostalgia for that post-war moment, people forget that it was also the era of, you know, smash the family, smash the state as a sort of feminist slogan. That's been completely forgotten, because it's this idea, well, we'll just return to a state of, we already had our utopia, we lost it, so now we have to go back to it, which seems to just discredit so much work that was done at that time by people who were living their lives in the midst of it.
Exactly. So I'm always a bit sort of wary of this, you know, a sort of nostalgia for the welfare state, when if we even just go back a few decades and look at what people were doing at that time, they had a much more critical attitude to what the state was doing, and were sort of very aware of how the state and local government were involved in the project of sort of enforcing various normative values, and also, you know, had a very important aspect of had a very important role as sort of a part of the capitalist system as a whole, and you know, part of the reason why that housing was provided was that it's cheaper for the sort of capitalist economy to provide cheap housing to workers, and I think that is something that we don't always talk about when we have this like idea of council housing as the sort of best version of housing. We don't talk about how the state at various points has sort of intervened in the sphere of social reproduction in order to like stabilize the capitalist economy, basically.
Yeah, I think the other key tenet of housing activism that you problematise a little bit is kind of related to this in a lot of ways, actually. And it's this idea that our housing woes stem primarily from financialisation. You know, that's one of the framings. And you depart a little bit from that familiar story. Just this idea that the home is no longer being seen primarily as a place in which to live, but instead it is primarily an investment vehicle, or it's an asset to profit from. And you don't dismiss this narrative. You do recognise where it comes from. You recognise that there's an element of truth in it. And you also understand why it's gained a lot of traction. But I think you come across as being really keen to remind the reader why housing is so profitable, namely because people require shelter, right? And if needs be, we will cough up quite a hefty portion of our wages in order to access it. And you also stress that this idea of a much-loved home, a cherished home, full of love and enjoyment and family connection, is not sealed off in any way from this idea of the home as an asset. So perhaps you could maybe say a few words here about how those two can and do go hand in hand a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's quite a lot of like good writing about financialisation as well. So as you said, I don't want to sort of dismiss that perspective entirely. And some of it is sort of very nuanced, very situated in understanding the local context. But it's become a little bit of this sort of explanation for why everything is so bad everywhere. In the sort of on a more global scale, if you talk to people who are involved in the housing movement in different countries and ask why is housing so bad, lots of people will say, oh, financialisation, without really thinking about how that sort of impacted the housing system in their local context. And I think there's a sort of crude understanding in some texts about what financialisation is. Sometimes it's articulated as a sort of bad capitalism, a sort of like bad foreign investment flooding our cities, and that is the cause of housing prices going up. So I'm quite critical of that sort of argument.
It suggests that there's a good captilism that's
exactly,
just sort of yeah.
There's a sort of better, a
better exploitation is possible, everybody.
If the capitalism was like British, then it wouldn't be a problem. But the fact is that the UK housing system is a very deeply British system in a way, and is quite specific. Because we have a country where, we have lots of small landlords, and it often isn't these big sort of institutional players that are really setting the tone of the housing market. So I wanted to challenge that a little bit and wanted to sort of unpick that, because I think in that narrative as well, there's this idea that through financialisation, housing has become commodified. But obviously, housing has never been decommodified under capitalism.
Yeah.
I think it's quite specific in the way that housing is sort of, in a way, the most commodified thing of all the things that we sort of need to live. It's very, very hard to access housing without paying for it.
Yeah.
And this idea that sort of bad foreign investors on buying up properties and leaving them empty, and that's the sort of cause of the housing shortage, for people who put it that way. I think it also needs to be challenged a little bit. There is quite a lot of empty properties that could be brought back into use, but a lot of them are not because of foreign capital buying up properties. It's because someone has died, the occupant has died, and their family members haven't dealt with their housing.
Yeah.
So that's the a main reason why there's an estimated 700,000 long-term empty homes in the UK. I think the other thing is that, as you mentioned, there's this idea that there's a sort of a distinction between bad commodified housing and then a family home that's sort of used and it has a use value. And that's the good type of housing that we all want. And obviously that's kind of the core idea that I want to challenge through this book, because I don't think those are necessarily separate things. If you think about, for example, inheritance and how upset people are when you start to challenge the idea of inheritance, they often talk about the sort of cherished family home as the thing that, it has to be passed on from a parent to their children. And I think a lot of people are very invested in this idea, and it does kind of make sense from that perspective. Obviously you want the people you love to sort of have a chance at a decent life, and you don't want to force them to sort of give up a family home. So that kind of makes sense as its own sort of narrative in a way. But it often leads to quite weird outcomes. It leads to an older generation being very attached to the idea that the value of their home will sort of keep increasing, because that would benefit their children, even if on a sort of social level it doesn't benefit their children's generation. It's often the very thing that means that a lot of people don't have access to buying a home. So it's this kind of strange thing where people get very invested in the sort of continuation of the continuation of ever increasing house prices, because they think they will sort of benefit their children, and in that way, I think family relationships and housing finance is very tied up, and you can't really separate them so neatly.
Yeah, I mean, I think this issue of generational wealth transfer really roots us in another crucial issue for your book, your previous book, my books, which is the family. So the home today, I think, is so deeply entangled with ideas of the family form that it's really hard to think about one without simultaneously conjuring up images of the other to some extent. And this is, of course, despite the fact that contemporary UK households can evolve all sorts of different ways. They can involve all sorts of different social formations that don't depend on genetic coincidence, that don't depend on predefined kind of caring roles or caring dynamics. And it's also despite the fact that a lot of so-called blood connections and family bonds don't involve physical proximity either. So households can be made up of strangers and families can be made up of members that are spread across oceans. And yet these ideas are still kind of amalgamated in the cultural imagination into this hybrid notion of the family household. And that's typically where a lot of people's minds will go the first time you mention one or the other. The home and the family, they're sort of welded in such a firm way in the way we think about things. So I guess my question for you is whether you think one can meaningfully transform the politics of housing without also transforming the politics of the family. And I guess more directly, whether you consider yourself to be working in the feminist tradition of family abolitionism.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think I see myself as part of that sort of revival of that idea of family abolition, which has a long history on the left. And, people like Sophie Lewis and Emmy O'Brien have done great work of sort of unpacking this idea and why it's such an important important principle, both for the left and for feminism. And I guess one of my slightly hot takes is that you can't really be on the left without also being critical of the family. I don't think being on the left and being pro-family is a very coherent political position, actually, because for me, being on the left means exactly a commitment to sort of being interested in the well-being of more people than can be in a sort of intimate sphere. So, I mean, in terms of that debate that was unfolding a few years ago, I think there's a lot of sort of willful misunderstandings of this idea of family abolition. Yeah. And maybe a bit of a claim that, the sort of the genuine working class, they are committed to their families and they don't want to abolish the family. So that's sort of what we have to defend as well, which I think just massively misunderstands the history of the family and takes the nuclear family, which is a very contemporary social form, as the sort of natural state of things and something that people sort of just desire,
spontaneously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's, if you actually look at the history of how that family form emerged, you can see that there was actually quite a lot of struggle around that idea, and they had to be imposed on quite a large parts of the working class. And so this idea that, this idea that people are dependent on their families, on the capitalism, that is sort of the only thing that we have, which a lot of people present as an argument against family abolition. I think we can just as easily sort of flip that around and say, that's exactly the problem. People don't have access to the care or the resources or the things that they need very easily outside of a family form. And people who are in families are often sort of privileged in various ways when it comes to meeting their needs. So that's the thing that we need to challenge in a way. That's not a reason to sort of defend the nuclear family or any form of family.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a real knee-jerk reaction against any kind of version of the weird left, right? Any idea that we might seem sort of peculiar or out of step with social norms will somehow make us politically untouchable. So ideas like family abolitionism and post-work, for example, I think people respond instinctively by imagining, sort of hallucinating a person who might be responding to the left, and then always thinking, well, you framed this improperly for them. But I think a lot of the time these ideas have real currency. They're really important. I mean, as your answer sort of made clear, actually there are lots of reasons to question things like work and family, regardless of how important they seem in our lives right now. We can also identify the ways in which they're not working for people, the ways in which that they are problems rather than solutions to our problems. If we all had families and all had nice homes, if we all had good jobs, that would be the end of it. Actually, there's lots of reasons why that's not the case, not least the fact that work is a form of, dual domination. You're dominated by your boss, and by the organisation that you work for, who tell you where you have to be and what you have to do, necessarily, as part of being work. But also in terms of just the impersonal domination of capitalism. You need to work to survive. You need to earn the wage so you can pay for your commodified housing so that you can continue to support your family. So I think these are...
Yeah, and there's a real, a sort of anti-utopian stream of left thinking today, which I'm obviously very keen to challenge. I think we sort of need to rediscover that more sort of utopian imagination, and this feels important for thinking about family and about housing as well, because I think if the sort of only solution that we can come up with is we're going to return to the mid-20th century, that's a very limited horizon, and people are actually not as invested in these forms of domination that people think, especially when you think about work. Lots of people just hate their jobs. They don't want to spend their life working. So that's just...
I feel like a lot of people just hate the left having ideas, from either side. It's whoa, come on. You're allowed to do a little bit of shit tinkering with the formula that we've already established. But if you go beyond that, then you're just you're damaging the brand somehow. Yeah. So in the book, you draw a little bit upon my idea of domestic realism. So I always like to be really clear that that's not the literary genre. It's really unfortunate that there is a literary genre called domestic realism. But instead, it's a riff on Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism. So basically, it's this idea that the social and spatial relations of the single family home have become just so ubiquitous and so naturalised that it's become a real challenge to imagine life being organised through any other form. And, this is despite the fact that, as we know, the home is labour intensive, it's energy intensive, as you make some of those points in terms of the building, but also the running of a household is massively energy intensive. Consumes masses of our time, masses of our money. And it's also this hotbed of gender-based violence and daily inequalities. And yet, aside from a range of fairly localised experiments, it doesn't seem like people very often go out looking for a serious alternative to the single-family home. Indeed, I think for many of us, it just feels that there isn't an alternative. There's no competing vision of the good life, even for people who don't really want to live in that form, or for people who feel like they'll never actually be able to access that form for one reason or another. So this cultural embeddedness is really only enhanced by the fact that the built environment literally concretizes a particular way of life. We can try to live differently within the walls and the floor plan of single family homes, but we're always going to be going against the grain of its design. We're always going to be running against its sort of inbuilt politics. And I think we're always going to be responding to it in some way, even in our attempted rejection. So it always puts if we're like, I don't want to live like this, you're starting from what you're rejecting. It's still shaped your imaginary to such an intense degree. So this is an example, I think, of material hegemony in action. And I was wondering if perhaps you could say a little bit more about how domestic dwellings foster certain modes of being. So I'm thinking about how the home has historically been used really as a disciplinary cudgel. It's one that's operated as this unevenly distributed subjectivity producing tool. So how did home contribute to the establishment of a more orderly working class in the 20th century, for example, something that you touch on in the book? And where are we still feeling the legacies of this today, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really rich and interesting history of just how homes have been so important in shaping people's sort of subjectivities, desires, desiring a certain family form, a certain form of ownership. and if you go back and look at that history, there's lots of examples from various contexts of people living in like really, really poor quality housing, and then sort of being offered something that's better, but in a quite a conditional way, right? So often when you go back to sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, a lot of the working class in various industrialized countries living in sort of slum conditions, lots of people dying because of their housing, especially, young children, not really being able to survive in their domestic environments because of, poor sanitation and overcrowding, lots of conditions that led to like diseases spreading very easily, like extreme temperatures, mold, damp, all of that. And then there were also like, you see a very different form of household during that time. Often, households were much bigger. You don't have this idea of a mom and dad and two little children as the sort of ideal of the household. Often people living in sort of more intergenerational ways. And often having much more like closer bonds to like their neighbours, and people living on the same street, and there being less of a distinction between the sort of the private sphere of the home and the public sphere of the street or the city in that way. And then for very good reason, a lot of that housing was demolished, and it was replaced by a sort of housing that was of better quality, but were often built on an idea of a nuclear family. The mother is now a housewife, and you have a smaller family, and ideas of like who's providing the childcare, who's doing the cooking. And that is sort of, you can see it in the sort of design manuals of the 20th century especially. It's very clear that that's what they had in mind, and they were sort of creating a household or a homes based on that. And, it's very easy to understand why people thought, oh, actually, that sounds good, because compared to some of what has gone before, it's, you want your children growing up in a home that isn't, full of damp and, cold temperatures and, things that are going to make them sick. So I think it's very easy to see why sort of large parts of the working class came to aspire to this sort of bourgeois ideal. Sometimes it had to be imposed sort of more forcefully, but it was also something that lots of people were like, we want that, we want that better quality of living. So even in the sort of more radical programs of creating that, for example, in Red Vienna, which is this like very cherished idea or model of the welfare state on the left, that in a way the sort of most radical idea when the socialist government of Vienna decided that they would provide a lot of the things that the working class needed. But they also built into the built environment of that project is based on certain types of ideas of like the nuclear family and women as providers of reproductive labour, and those two things sort of came hand in hand. So people who maybe just wanted something like a good place to live were also sort of made to give up a different form of social reproduction, where they were like living more closely with people who weren't their family members, and often like sharing childcare in particular kinds of ways, and not living so much according to that bourgeois distinction between private and public.
Where are we seeing that in the way that people are living today, do you think? The legacies of that?
Yeah. I think it's interesting that there's some similarities today between how many people experience their sort of housing situation and what people were experiencing in the sort of late 19th century. I think some people experience this as a bit of a return to the like pre-welfare state era, which kind of makes sense when you think about some people having to live in these like very overcrowded conditions, and especially like during lockdown, suddenly being sort of having to share space with lots of strangers and not being able to leave while there was, a deadly virus going around.
And also, I think the reappearance of children dying because of their housing conditions, dying because of mould, asthma attacks, things like that.
Yeah. And even the sort of more everyday aspects of this, people sharing housing with people they don't really know. Maybe there's someone staying in the living room because that's a way to make housing more affordable, or even sleeping in the kitchen. Those are sort of all symptoms of the housing system that we're in today. And on that basis, it's quite easy to see why the sort of the same desires keep re-emerging, because that is the sort of the solution that we've been given to the conditions that we're in. Like, obviously, if the options that you have to choose between are like very overcrowded housing that you might share with people that you don't even know or that you don't like that much, and you don't feel like you have any choice or any control of that situation, obviously it seems better to, have your own home, live with family members, and sort of invest in that idea of a good life. And I think because of that sort of limited horizon, those seeming like the only options, it's quite easy to see why people are sort of become invested in a particular idea of security, even if we can see like that might not be the only sort of available options.
Yeah. Fun fact is I developed bronchiectasis because of the shitty little flat that I lived in on my gap year, which was black with mould. We had a dehumidifier in there. It was just like it was basically one room with a kitchen and a toilet, and that was it. And we kept talking to the landlord about this, and they were like, well, it's because you're washing clothes and having baths, and you're sort of like, kind of part of like taking care of the whole like being a human part of things. And so basically I'm completely fucked in terms of breathing for the rest of my life because of the crap flat I lived in when I was 18. So yeah, it's definitely like consumptive 19th century vibes, what I'm going for. Okay, so you build on this idea of domestic realism by introducing the notion of domestic romance, which is, just to very briefly paraphrase, a sense that our current model of domestic life is not only necessary, it's not only inevitable, it's actually good. It's, it's correct, it's desirable, it's how we should want to live. And what underpins this romance, in your opinion? How does it relate to domestic realism? And why do we come to desire things that hurt us? Is it simply a matter of life outside of home-owning domestic security just feeling so deeply precarious and endangering? Or is there something else at play here, do you think?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, it just is the fact that other forms of housing feel like really insecure, that that's the sort of reason why it might come to desire more security in the first place. And it's quite interesting for me as someone who grew up in Sweden, where I could see this sort of transformation in the course of my lifetime. So, later than the UK, US, the countries that went through a sort of neoliberal phase a bit earlier. And a real shift from everyone thinking that, just like getting council housing is the thing that we want, to like, lots of people that I meet in Stockholm are now talking about, the lovely home that they've just bought. And you can see a real investment in this idea of home ownership being good because of sort of public housing becoming less and less available as well. But I think there's something more than that, and I think here's where you can sort of see quite a reactionary ideology at play, and it's interesting because it's sort of so it's so ingrained with the sort of things that we all want, just like housing security, like having a home that's nice and comfortable. Like that makes sense that we should want that, but often it's sort of very much tied up with ideas of ownership, and being, if you are a homeowner, that means that you are sort of like a real grown-up, and that you're like a proper citizen. So there's quite a lot of like ideas of like who the homeowner is in relation to who's a tenant or a renter, and a lot of people, desiring that sort of respectability as well, and take a lot of pleasure in the idea of like having a home that's like nice and respectable and looks pretty, and that being a sort of signal of social status, of having sort of made it in life, and that is something that sort of functions because other people don't have access to that. Right? You can only like use your nice home as a status symbol if it's not available to everyone. Yeah.
Idea of sort of luxury as a positional good. But yeah, I really hate the mobilisation of the homeowner as a kind of like category of personhood. It's indiscreet of me to say this, but I live in a complex of apartments, and there's been a lot of arguing within this complex about, so there's a kids play area, which is just like dreamy if you've got small children like I do. You've got like a little teeny tiny area where there's like a climbing frame for them. There's like some little wooden sheep that they can climb on and ride. And somebody who lives near this has been complaining about the noise of the children. Like the children are playing and they're being noisy. And the way that they phrased this in their text message to the WhatsApp group was like, can we please think about the homeowners? And I was like, Jesus Christ. It's just like, seems to embody so much of what's wrong with that kind of take. Like, first of all, you buy a flat that's like right near where there is a children's play area, and then the sounds of happy children disrupt your life so much that they feel the need to try and suppress that aggressively. So
there's a chapter in the book where I had quite a lot of fun reading these like quite reactionary thinkers writing about housing, and one of them is a person called Alice Coleman, and she was writing about how having a playground on your estate creates antisocial behavior, and it's quite wild. And you have, I think, a bit more of an extreme version of this argument of defensible space, being able to control your local area. That is sort of mobilized in a lot of fascist thinking as well, and this idea of a homeowner being able to sort of defend their private property with violence if needed, which is a sort of white supremacist patriarchal fantasy.
It's very libidinized, isn't it? That idea of there will be an acceptable outlet for me to unleash my rage.
Yeah, I feel like slightly, those memes about Adorno and like this is fascism and this is fascism. I have this, idea that I think a lot of what seems to be like these fairly innocent fantasies of like, just wanting to have a nice place, have some kind of connection with deeply reactionary ideas of like being able to defend the domestic space, both in the sense of the home, but also in the nation.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that thing about, I remember being very struck by that in the book, this idea that like, oh, well, if there are too many play spaces, children will be out and about and playing and not in their homes. And just sort of how that fits into a framework of private sufficiency and public luxury, because the idea is that, well, everybody has to bring everything within the confines of the home. And then you need, how much space would we need in London for every child and every sort of sibling group to have their own space that's adequate for them to play in? There's not enough physical space in London for that to be made possible. We need to have these spaces which are sort of rich and luxurious and pleasant to be in, and satisfy that sort of that human need for for space and play that isn't defined by home and by, what is the boundaries of your plot. Okay, so it seems to me that there's really a dual project involved here. One in which we struggle to make alternative domestic arrangements seem not just possible, but desirable, making them something that people feel they can achieve and also something that they want to achieve at the same time. So I guess the question then is how do we do that? And how do we first enable choice in terms of living arrangements, and then enable a new ideological infrastructure to emerge in which the good life is just not automatically equated with the single family home and the two sort of charming children and the well-maintained lawn and the personal car and all of that. And of course, that's always the question with these things is what do we do? So I'm not looking for a blueprint, but I'm wondering if there are a few little embers and sparks that we could talk about that might help ignite some movement on this front.
I think part of the answer to this is that there have to be quite big changes to just the basic functioning of the housing system sort of first. And that's because of just the material constraints of how the housing system sort of functions right now, and housing being so expensive especially means that our choices are very limited. So there probably has to be some sort of movement-based work on that, and in a way the solutions that I'm proposing on what happens in the short term is not very different from what many other people have said about what needs to happen to housing politics. It's like, Section 21 evictions need to go, and that needs to happen soon. Rent controls, and basically anything that could bring down the price of housing. But I think what I sort of part ways with some of that, some of those writings is in terms of what happens after that. And I think, that's why I'm sort of resisting this idea that, if we just reduce the price of housing and make sure it's better quality, then it will be all fine. What I wanted to bring was a bit more of a sort of utopian or like visionary idea for what housing could look like, thinking about housing not just as the sort of the number of like affordable family homes that are available, but thinking about how we can sort of change the idea that we have of the domestic sphere as a whole, integrating housing more with the sort of the other things that we need to live good and dignified lives, and slightly challenging this idea of like scarcity, which I think is impacting lots of people's thinking around like family life, resources, and if we want to change society, we sort of have to start chipping away at some of those ideas of like how resources are distributed, how labour is distributed, and I think housing and having like a more sort of visionary idea of what housing could be is a really interesting starting point for doing that, because we could think about housing in such a different way if we start thinking about sort of more communal forms of living, and housing where we have the other things that we might want from life. Access to childcare near our homes, communal cooking facilities, and other things that we sort of need to live just like decent lives. But also what I think is really important about After Work, your book, is that it's also starting to think about what other things we might actually want, having that as a horizon. For me, that's such a more interesting version of like thinking about housing than just being like, oh, we want to return to like mid-20th century forms of housing, because that's just like, it's a bit boring.
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of phrased the question in quite an inelegant way, because it's sort of, the way that I was talking about it was like, well, how do we make it possible, and then how do we make it desirable? Actually, it's so recursive, right? You've got this loop where actually you need the desire. You need to this idea of utopia is the education of desire, right? How do we create housing utopias which are like it doesn't have to look the way that it currently looks. There are, perhaps there are other forms of domestic romance that we could identify with and aspire to outside of this, and that might then feed into what becomes materially possible, just as what is materially possible plays into what can feel like more concrete kinds of utopia. And that kind of brings me to my last question, I think, which is really about this issue of imagining alternatives. So, in the spirit of domestic romance, then, let me ask you about your ideal domestic arrangement. So how would you live if you were operating under conditions of freedom in which some kind of meaningful choice was possible? And relatedly, do you have any favourite sort of examples of homes or homeliness that you think about when you're imagining alternatives to domestic realism and domestic romance?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's interesting to think of the sort of ideal of housing as a sphere of freedom and of safety, and freedom because of safety as well, and like freedom and choice on the basis of having the things that we need. So no one being sort of forced to make like very limited decisions based on oh well, I need to have this kind of home in order to sort of secure a decent life for my children, for example. So I feel like that's as a sort of principle should be the basis for how we think about housing, and I think that also opens up the question of people having control, sort of collective control over the spaces that they inhabit, and being able to like shape those spaces collectively, having more sort of flexibility in terms of the domestic spaces that we live in, and having more sort of collectively shared resources available to us as well. So I mean, that's the sort of post-revolutionary horizon is that world where we all had access to the things that we need and want, and could access them sort of in our domestic environments as well. Obviously that is very hard to to sort of imagine under capitalism, where especially in a system where housing finance and sort of the property market has become such an important sector for maintaining capitalism as a whole. But I think it's interesting to go back even like a few decades to when a time when housing was a bit cheaper and it wasn't so like controlled in a way, and there's a sort of rich history of people squatting in a way that now squatting is like it's quite hard to do, and the spaces that you get access to are often like they're not very good. Yeah. But there are examples like historically of people taking over like spaces that were actually like really nice homes, and not just like using them as living space, but also like using them as spaces that were doing something sort of politically, and offering shelter to people who were sort of excluded from the more like normative white bourgeois idea of the family home as well. So when you think about like queer and trans people sort of creating homes together in squatted housing, or sort of women's groups setting up shelters for domestic violence survivors, or in East London, migrant Bengali families squatting houses because the council wouldn't give them adequate housing. Those were often spaces where people sort of came together around a shared political aim and created domestic space that were offering shelter, but not in a sort of closed bourgeois form of like the very securitized home, but a domestic space that was sort of open and offered space not just for living, but also for for doing politics, for being part of a movement, for sharing resources, and like just the domestic space being not this separate thing, but really part of the political life of that community. And I guess that's something that I'm interested in thinking more about, if there's a way that we can integrate those aspects of social reproduction in our political movements a bit more today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alva. It was really lovely to talk to you, and everybody should buy this book, which is a wonderful achievement and really nicely written, easy. You can give it to your mum and dad, they'll pick it up and they'll get it, they'll like it. So yeah, thank you, Alva.
Thanks.